It came as a shock to the nation's major media. Not Reagan's death. He was old, ailing, and suffering from Alzheimer's disease. What stunned the members of the media was how loved Reagan was, how America came out by the hundreds of thousands to pay tribute to this great leader. Historians had not been kind to the deceased president either.
The standard portrayal of Reagan is one of a washed-up movie actor who got into politics, not particularly bright, sleeps in the morning, has other people do his decision-making for him. According to these interpretations, behaved as a warmonger and ran up huge deficits.
The people knew better. They knew the media and the historians were wrong.
Both groups had fooled themselves into thinking their view of Ronald Reagan was the view held by the American public as a whole. And it wasn't. Not even close.
Certainly the founders would have loved the Gipper, as Reagan was affectionately known. Visionary and decisive, simple, but not simplistic. Reagan would soon rate as one of our greatest leaders. A patriot writing our history would look much differently at the Reagan years. If America had a rock-bottom point, 1979 would be it. President Jimmy Carter, a man of limited vision and leadership, struggled. He scolded Americans for their high expectations, and without actually using the word, proclaimed that the United States suffered from a malaise.
The late 1970s was the worst period of our economic history since the Great Depression. And because we had rising unemployment and rising inflation, tremendous unhappiness, there was a sense of malaise that there was nothing we could do. And we had a situation where people were talking about a crisis of confidence. President Carter had a speech where he talked about a crisis of confidence. He didn't seem to have answers. The New York Post at one point had a headline that said, "What are you up to, Mr. President?"
While domestic issues were troubling, the foreign threats Carter faced were downright dangerous. Throughout the 1970s, the Soviet Union had massed gigantic missiles specifically designed to destroy American ICBMs in their silos in a first strike. Such an attack, launched only upon remote bases in largely unpopulated parts of the United States, could decapitate any American nuclear response, leaving the nation and its leaders helpless. The perception of American weakness encouraged other nations to act with impunity against the United States. The Soviets also became more aggressive, more reckless.
Many people on the left, particularly academics, thought that if you adopted a conciliatory view of the Soviet Union, if you just played nice, everything would work out. The Soviets had a much different view of the world. As Lenin said, probe with a bayonet. If you encounter flesh, keep going. If you encounter steel, withdraw.
Carter seemed befuddled, unable to cope with the crumbling economy at home or the threats abroad. Without a vision, the people perish. The nation looked for leadership and none was found, until, that is, another man rose up. At 70 years old, Ronald Reagan, a former actor and governor of California, seemed younger and more vibrant than Carter, many years his junior.
Reagan was the epitome of everything the radical academics hated. He didn't pretend to be an intellectual like John F. Kennedy or Adlai Stevenson. He was an actor, not a lawyer or an activist, and he really did believe in the essential goodness of the American people.
Reagan believed the strength of the nation was its people, not its government, but the people were only powerful if unshackled from inflation and high taxes. On the stump, he relentlessly pounded on two issues: unleashing the economic power of the free market by reducing taxes and restoring the nation's military to preeminence.
When Mr. Carter or Mr. Mondale say they simply cannot balance the budget, provide for the national security, and reduce the high tax load on the American people, I say stand aside, because we can and we will.
Seen by many as an upset, Reagan crushed Carter in the Electoral College. Historians, a majority of whom were liberals who fundamentally detested Reagan's principles, tried to portray the new president as a dim bulb. One popular textbook wrote, "Critics questioned his grasp of complex issues." Another observed, "Reagan was no intellectual." Despite the fact that subsequent copies of Reagan's handwritten radio addresses in the 1970s and his presidential diaries revealed an active mind that addressed a wide range of issues with great sophistication. Yet this B actor, this lucky, dense bumpkin as he was portrayed, somehow connected with large majorities of Americans.
What was his secret? And I think there are many answers to that, and there are facets and subfacets of the answer I'm going to give, but I think a lot of it had to do with his values. He believed that America was essentially a decent place. He knew America had failings, he knew Americans had failings, but he believed that when all was said and done, Americans were decent people who tried to do the right thing and had done the right thing throughout history.
Defeating the Soviet Union required a strong, vibrant economy, and putting that economy back on its feet required allowing the people to keep more of their own money. Taxes for the Gipper were the key. Cut taxes, and employment, production, and growth would all follow.
President Reagan learned from history. His tax cuts that he promoted in the 1980s were tremendously successful. He studied Andrew Mellon, Calvin Coolidge, and the tax cuts of the 1920s. He knew that cutting taxes not only would generate and stimulate investment, but it would also have the effect of increasing federal revenue, because the more people made, the more they were able to pay. When Reagan promoted his tax cuts in the 1980, across-the-board tax cuts, that's exactly what happened. And it worked exactly as it did for Coolidge in the 1920s. Not only was investment stimulated, but more revenue was generated, almost a doubling of revenue into the federal government during the 1980s.
The economic indicators began to reflect Reagan's policies. Employment rose, the stock market soared, interest rates plunged.
Agenda-driven academics have jumped through hoops to show that some aspect, any aspect, of Reagan's economic plans were flawed. They settled on the large deficits, which had never bothered them during the New Deal or the Great Society. It's almost like a pig complaining about mud.
One of the most startling distortions of Reagan's record comes to us in a textbook which is widely used in colleges throughout the country called The American Pageant. And in that textbook there are charts that purport to measure Reagan's economic record and portray inflation and deficit spending and other measures of his economic record, and yet the charts are compiled without using a standard economic tool, which is to adjust for inflation using real dollars.
This was incredibly deceptive because all prices have risen over time.
Larry Schweikart, then working on a history of American business, used the textbook's sources to recreate the chart, except that he adjusted it for inflation and put the numbers in relation to U.S. gross national product.
After all, how much you owe is largely dependent on how much you make. How much did the U.S. owe relative to how much it made? This book, like so many others, had to fudge the real data to make Reaganomics look bad. In fact, Reaganomics worked, and so did millions of Americans.
Inflation, which had made up half of Jimmy Carter's misery index, all but disappeared. But Reagan had already turned his attention to the Russian bear. The first priority was to slam shut the window of vulnerability left from the 1970s. In a series of executive decisions, Reagan restored the B-1 bomber program, the MX missile development, and the deployment of cruise missiles on land, sea, and air platforms. Two coincidences added to Reagan's tough image. Minutes after he was sworn in, Iran released the hostages it had held for over a year. And shortly after Reagan's inauguration, the first Trident submarine completed sea trials, far exceeding the Navy's expectations and giving the United States a ballistic missile submarine vastly superior to anything possessed by the Soviets. These weapons systems were merely tools to implement a bold new strategy to deal with the USSR. The germ of the new approach came from events in the tiny Caribbean island of Grenada, when a communist group staged a coup and Cubans immediately sought to consolidate power there. U.S. forces moved quickly to prevent another communist bastion in the Western Hemisphere, in the process saving a number of American medical students in danger there.
Why are we playing defense here? Can't we do something to roll back the evil empire?
Ronald Reagan's revival of an anti-communist American foreign policy, for the first time in decades, really called a spade a spade. He called the Soviet Union's leaders evil. He referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire, a sworn enemy of freedom and religion.
Earlier that year, Reagan had philosophically turned the corner in his views on how to deal with the Soviets.
So in your discussions of the nuclear freeze proposals, I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil. Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet dictator, roundly condemned the speech, claiming that abuses had occurred in a different era. In fact, Gorbachev's workers' paradise had its own brand of imperialism. For years, the Mujahideen had resisted Soviet forces in Afghanistan, but had been unable to overcome Russian air superiority, particularly helicopters, which allowed the Soviets to track the freedom fighters into the mountains.
A diplomat stationed in the American embassy in Moscow, writing under the nom de plume X, set forth the theory of containment.
Since 1946, American presidents and policymakers had resigned themselves to the view that communism could only be contained, that the United States did not have the military power to liberate nationals and peoples already conquered. That was about to change.
Churchill, in negotiating with the Soviets, observed that they respect only strength and resolve in their dealings with other nations. That's why we've moved to reconstruct our national defenses. We intend to keep the peace. We will also keep our freedom.
In fact, the newly labeled Reagan Doctrine went much further than merely resisting the Soviets or supporting those who were fighting their proxies. It meant, for the first time ever, actually rolling back existing communist territory and liberating current subjugated states. Congress did not share Reagan's goal of liberating countries enslaved by the communists. Too destabilizing, legislators warned. While the Democrats managed to block funding for the Nicaraguan Contras, Reagan found an ally in Texas Representative Charlie Wilson, one of the few Democrat hawks in the House.
The Reagan administration began to funnel Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to the Afghan rebels. And this really made a difference. It leveled the playing field. Indeed, it gave the Afghans the advantage. And those missiles leveled the playing field.
Soviet losses started to pile up. For the first time in its history, the communist leadership of the USSR began to hear widespread grumbling about the war. Defeating communism on the periphery, however important, remained secondary to limiting, or better yet, neutralizing the Soviets' ability to destroy the United States with nuclear strikes.
When the Soviets got their own atomic bomb, and then in 1957 put up Sputnik, that meant that ICBMs were possible, such as these. I'm standing here in the United States Air Force Museum among the weapons that Ronald Reagan helped authorize to win the Cold War. Intercontinental ballistic missiles meant that no part of the Earth was safe from a nuclear attack. The strategy that ensued was called MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. In other words, the only way for us to ensure that a Soviet nuclear strike never took place was a counterstrike in which we launched everything we had. And therefore, they would never launch an attack in the first place.
The first step in this journey consisted of preventing any new missiles from being added to the mix. In the last years of the Carter administration, the USSR introduced an entirely new class of mobile missiles, highly destabilizing because they could change locations after American satellites flew over, making them essentially invisible.
The Soviet deployment of the SS-20 missiles in Europe was an escalation of the worst possible kind. It had a specific purpose, and that was to intimidate Western Europeans and to force them to withdraw from NATO, thus destroying the great anti-communist military alliance.
Carter intended to do nothing about the new weapons, but to Reagan, they constituted an unreasonable and intolerable new threat. The Gipper found a strong ally in Great Britain's Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, whose views of Soviet communism mirrored his own.
Despite some of the largest protests in history, Reagan and Margaret Thatcher continued to deploy 400 cruise and Pershing missiles in Western Europe. They responded to the Soviets tit for tat. Before long, Gorbachev was calling for a treaty to remove all missiles from Western Europe, showing that Reagan's strategy of fighting fire with fire was effective.
Removing the Euro missiles in Reagan's mind only got him back to square one. It meant that mutual assured destruction still had to be dealt with. A balance of terror was unacceptable to Reagan, whose lifelong dream had been to eliminate nuclear weapons.
Ronald Reagan hated nuclear weapons. He looked for a way out, some way to completely abolish all atomic weapons.
In the 1970s, both the CIA and the U.S. Air Force had confirmed that the Soviets were engaging in wide-ranging laser and charged particle beam tests.
Brace yourself for immediate disintegration.
You shouldn't fool around with firearms, Shorty. This thing just might be loaded, you know. Yeah, you can't be too careful with guns. Good heavens, he evaporated.
Academics and journalists who had grown up in the Commander Cody and Buck Rogers era failed to notice that technology had changed, and what once was difficult or impossible suddenly was within our grasp.
I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive.
The president had not used the term space or laser beams. Yet immediately journalists and academics rushed to label this new strategic defense initiative Star Wars in reference to George Lucas's 1977 mega-hit movie about interplanetary war.
In foreground comes a very attractive laser battle station, which then makes a noise like bzz, bzz, bzz. There's a blue flash, and the Soviet warheads disappear. They don't even fragment. They're just gone from the screen. And you get a very strong sense that this is not only easy, but fun.
Many leftist critics, particularly academics, were so out of touch with the American people that in attempting to ridicule SDI as Star Wars, they provided Reagan, the great communicator, a chance to instantly communicate to the American people the benefits of Star Wars, most of whom had seen the movie. Despite the incredible age difference, people actually identified Reagan with Luke Skywalker. Gorbachev was clearly Darth Vader, and many of these ancient, decrepit Soviet leaders like Brezhnev and Chernenko were the evil emperor.
One of the first places that Star Wars made itself felt was in the Soviet economy. The Soviets had been spending somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of their GNP. Now, with Star Wars, to match the United States, they would have to spend even more.
It was really like a Western movie, with Reagan as the card shark at the poker table, knowing that his opponent is almost out of money and deciding to call his bluff. And so you can almost imagine him looking at the Soviets and pushing the big stack of chips into the middle of the table. And the Soviets folded. They were broke.
While Western intellectuals mocked Star Wars, the Soviets feared it. Gorbachev especially knew the capabilities of American technology and industry. Above all, he appreciated the new power of the computer, a power that only the United States had.
Reagan never explicitly talked about the connection between computers and Star Wars. In his biography, An American Life, he never even wrote much about computers, but it was clear he understood the key connection between technology and the larger Cold War.
We know what's going on. You Americans are inspired by illusions. You think you're ahead of us in information technologies. You think you're ahead of us in technology, and that you can use these things to gain superiority over the Soviet Union. Even now, due to computer technology, one side could get ahead in space. But we can match any challenge, though you might not think so. The crusade declared by US President Reagan is not just talk. It is an action program aimed at rolling back communism.
Computing power was increasing information exponentially. Now, the Soviets needed that computing power to keep up with the United States. The problem is they didn't have the free markets to generate the entrepreneurs who would create improvements in computer technology.
Either way, Reagan had them.
Even before a single satellite was built, before a single laser fired, the Soviets could see the chessboard, and it was checkmate.
The Soviets only had two options for dealing with Star Wars. First, they could oversaturate the system with ICBMs such as these. But that was expensive. They were already spending between 1/4 and 1/2 of their GNP on the military. The other option was they could out-tech us, but that wasn't very likely. Reagan put computers, high-tech equipment on the do not sell list, and they could not acquire them. They couldn't make them themselves. Have you ever heard of a Soviet Steve Jobski or Bill Gateski? As a result, it meant that they were in a box, and Gorbachev was terrified.
In our free market economy, the price of computer chips was falling dramatically. But the advantages of computer information were increasing exponentially.
And it wasn't just that we were ahead of them. We were racing ahead of them at light speed. and they were struggling to catch up.
Ironically, even if the Soviet Union somehow had managed to adapt to the technologies needed to keep up with Star Wars, those very technologies pulled apart the totalitarian fabric of a communist government by the very freedom they demanded.
The very nature of the personal computer was freedom. People could communicate freely, and when they could communicate freely, they could talk politics. Control was becoming absolutely impossible, as we now see.
Already, a primitive version of the internet called ARPANET was in operation. The seeds of the modern World Wide Web had already been planted.
But it was clear he understood the connection between the technology, the computers, and the larger global conflict.
Large numbers of Soviet engineers now were connected with one another through personal computers and email. The former ability of the Soviet state to control speech and communication was rendered obsolete.
And once people start communicating, even about technical things, like missiles or engineering designs, pretty soon the communication turns to politics and gripes. What are things like in your city? Do you have food on your shelves?
Widespread communication in a dissatisfied society produces revolution.
It's no accident that the American Revolution took off when Sam Adams and Tom Paine began communicating their dissent to the masses.
Ronald Reagan instinctively recognized the position Star Wars placed the Soviets in. So did Gorbachev. Agreeing to summit meetings, the Soviet premier repeatedly demanded an end to Star Wars in return for reductions in Soviet missiles. No dice, said Reagan. Star Wars is off the table. Reagan's successor vowed to continue his programs. Even before the Gipper left office, the evil empire had started to unravel. It seemed like only yesterday Reagan had demanded,
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Now the Germans were doing it themselves. When the Soviet Union imploded, not with a bang but with a whimper, it fell apart so suddenly that Western governments were taken by surprise. Western academics were even more stunned. But the Russian people knew it was not Gorbachev, but Ronald Reagan who had liberated them. The fall of the communist Soviet system had largely been achieved by one man and one speech. It was a love letter, Ronald Reagan's last love letter to the American people. My fellow Americans, I've recently been told that I am one of the millions of Americans who will be afflicted with Alzheimer's disease. I intend to live the remainder of the years God gives me on this earth, doing the things I have always done. I will continue to share life's journey with my beloved Nancy and my family. Let me thank you, the American people, for giving me the great honor of allowing me to serve as your president. When the Lord calls me home, whenever that may be, I will leave the greatest love for this country of ours and eternal optimism for its future. I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead. Within a few years, the Gipper would no longer recognize his children or his beloved Nancy. In death, Ronald Reagan reminded everyone that one man with a patriotic vision, a love for America, and the courage of his convictions can and did change the world.